Why did Alexander the Great spare Jerusalem, particularly when they were in covenant against his enemy, Darius, the king of Persia? That's a question we're going to explore in this video. It's a sign of God's supernatural intervention and protection of Israel and Jerusalem. One of the interesting stories that got my attention when I was a new Christian is the story of Alexander the Great. Alexander was a very, very pivotal character in the history of the Middle East. And I want to point out that he was an educated individual. At 13, his father Philip, who had conquered all of the area of Greece, was looking for a tutor. And after interviewing various tutors, Philip, his father, chose Aristotle. He provided the temple of nymphs at Mysa as a classroom. Mysa was like a boarding school for Alexander and the children of the Macedonian nobles. Ptolemy's children were there, Cassandra's children were there. Many of these students would become friends and future generals and are often referred to in history as the companions. Aristotle taught Alexander and his companions about medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic, and art. What is very important is one of the things Aristotle taught was the Greek gods were made up or false. He taught of a one God that was a creator. Now, it wasn't a personal God like we know through the Jewish tradition or through Christianity. It was more like a creator God that gave the universe a push to get it started. Alexander was very well educated. He had a passion for Homer. The Iliad was carried with him many times as his reading when he would be in his campaigns. But anyway, this young man at 20 years old became the leader of Macedonia and thus Greece because his father was assassinated. This is starting into a very interesting chapter. As a young general, he started to conquer the known world. In his battles, he worked his way down through the coast of Lebanon and then down into Israel. One of his bitter campaigns was one of his interesting battles is he came against Tyre, which was considered to be a fortified city that was unconquerable. Through his knowledge of modern warfare techniques such as siege ramps and naval attacks, Alexander, after a year-long siege, was able to go and completely destroy Tyre. That's along the coast of Lebanon. From there, he proceeded down and quickly conquered the Gaza area. This is where it gets interesting. Only 30 miles away from where Gaza was Jerusalem. And there's an interesting story in the Bible where Alexander the Great now turns his attention to that area. I want to mention that there's only a couple accounts of this campaign. Some are in the rabbinic writings where they talk about Jerusalem. And so it's also covered in the Talmud. But the primary historian that covers Alexander the Great in this particular interaction with the Jews in Jerusalem is Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus lived from 37 to 100 AD, and he was the most important writer about the whole biblical era. Although he was Jewish, he was employed by the Romans to write the Jewish history, in which he did with two important volumes, The Jewish War and The Antiquities of the Jews. In an earlier video, I said that sometimes he was prone to embellishment. As I really dug into this and a lot more, actually he was a very reliable historian. And since he was writing mostly about contemporary events, people were still alive that could have corrected, particularly those within Judaism, could have corrected him about what he had written. And so he's now, with a lot more research, has a lot more credibility than I mentioned. It was some of the liberal scholars that were really criticizing Flavius Josephus because he writes about a couple miracles that occurred, and they have no place for that. Let me go into this time period. I mentioned Alexander the Great. He started his campaign to have a conquest of the known world, particularly the Persian Empire, and that was in 334 BC. A character in this story is Jadis. Jadis was the high priest in Jerusalem at this time, and he'll be the one that will be featured in Josephus' account of what took place. Back hundreds of years before this, in fact, in 551 BC, Daniel had prophesied, and this is in the third year of the king Belshazzar's reign, the rise of Greece and how he would go ahead and have a conquest of the Medo-Persian Empire. So this was prophesied well in advance, several hundred years in advance of Alexander the Great. And just a review of Daniel's prophecy, this comes from Daniel 8:3. As I raised my eyes, look, there was a ram standing before the watercourse, and it had two horns. The two horns were tall, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up later. Immediately after seeing the ram, the prophet sees another fearsome beast. It's hairy, it's a he-goat, and it's closing in on the ram with the two horns. As I kept watching, there was a male goat coming from the west, crossing the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had that conspicuous horn between its eyes. It was coming toward the ram with the two horns, which I had seen before along the watercourse, and it was running toward it in a powerful rage. I saw it closing in on the ram, and it was filled with bitterness towards it. It struck down the ram and broke its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand up to it. It threw the ram to the ground and trampled it down, and there was no one to rescue it from the power. The prophet was told of the identities of the beast, and I'm going to talk about that. This comes from Daniel 8:5-7, but I want to mention one of the characteristics of Alexander the Great's warfare was the speed that he moved. And that was one of the things that was unique about this ram traveling along without touching the ground, was the fact that Alexander's type of warfare was like a blitzkrieg. It was very fast in his offense. Now, here's where the prophet is told of the identity of these beasts. The two-horned ram that you saw stands for the kings of Media and Persia. The hairy male goat stands for the king of Greece. And the great horn that was between its eyes stands for its very first king. Daniel 8:20 and 21. It's very clear by the context that that is Alexander the Great. He was the first king of Greece, and he was the one that defeated Media and Persia. The siege of Tyre was a very difficult and long siege. It actually took almost a year. And after that siege, Alexander turned his attention to a very significant coastal city of Gaza. And again, that's the border to go down to Egypt along the coast. This was a normally very heavily traveled trade route. Gaza was rapidly defeated. Now, just 30 miles away was Jerusalem, and it's very important because Jerusalem had still sworn to uphold its treaty of allegiance and tribute to Darius. And the city of Jerusalem and the high priest refused to break their treaty. Darius had made them promise for as long as he was alive that the Jews would not bear arms against him and that they would be faithful with their tribute and recognize his influence. This made Alexander very angry. Correspondence actually took place during that time of Tyre. So as soon as Gaza was destroyed, then Alexander turned east. From Josephus' account, when Jadis the high priest heard that Alexander was coming, he was terrified and ordered his people to join him in sacrifice to God. And so they reached out to God in prayer. That night, appearing to Jadis in a dream, God told him to take courage and to decorate the city with wreaths. The people were to clothe themselves in white, and the priests were to wear the robes of their orders. They were to march out the gates to meet the Macedonians, and they would not be harmed. Jadis awoke rejoicing, and he announced his dream to all. When he learned that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in the procession with the priests and the people. Alexander saw the procession coming to him, and the priests clothed in linen, and the high priest in a robe of blue and gold. And on his head was a mitre with a gold plate on which God's name was inscribed. Approaching alone, Alexander prostrated himself before the name and greeted the high priest. As the Jews welcomed Alexander with one voice and encircled him, his officers wondered if he had suddenly become insane. One of them, Parmetio, went up to Alexander and asked him, "Would you please explain?" He answered, "When I was in Macedonia, considering how I could become master of Asia, I saw this very person in my sleep, dressed as he is now. He urged me not to delay, but to cross over confidently and take dominion over the Persians. This person appeared to me in many of our campaigns." Josephus goes on to say that Alexander goes into the temple and made sacrifices to God under the direction of the high priest. The book of Daniel was shown to him, and the scrolls revealed that he was the one that was going to conquer the Persian Empire. And so he, revealed in the book of Daniel, was shown as the designated one by God, and that was pointed out by the high priest.